The morning Marcus Hayes walked into the Harwell Classic Car Auction, nobody gave him a second look. He arrived wearing work clothes, the kind that carry the history of a man's hands in their fibers. Faint traces of engine oil along the knuckles, a smear of bearing grease near the left cuff that had survived 3 washings and decided to stay. He held a folded auction program in one hand marked in pencil at several points, and with the other hand he held the small, warm hand of a 7-year-old girl named Zoe, who was wearing a t-shirt printed with a cartoon cross-section of a 4-speed transmission, and who had been annotating her own copy of the program with a purple marker since they arrived at the convention hall 40 minutes before the first lot. The Harwell Classic Car Auctions is held every year at Harwell Convention Center on the northern end of the city in a hall that smelled of leather conditioner and the specific kind of ambition that travels well in tailored clothes. Men in suits stood near velvet dividers with glasses of sparkling water, speaking at the volume of people who have learned that the truly wealthy do not need to project. Women in heels moved through the space with the measured efficiency of people for whom this was not entertainment, but business conducted in a pleasant room. The 2 auctioneers at the front of the hall moved through each lot with the precision of professionals who understood that their job was not to create excitement, but to manage it. Marcus stood near the side aisle. There was a folding chair beside him that he was not using because Zoe had claimed his shoulders instead, her small sneakers resting against his chest, her eyes moving steadily from car to car as each lot was rolled under the lights. She held her program in both hands and had been crossing out vehicles as they sold, leaving small purple notations beside each one. "That one has a bent steering column," she said, pointing at a 1958 Chevrolet being pushed past by 2 floor crew members. "Good eye," Marcus said quietly. He was not here for the Chevrolet. He was not here for the 1963 Corvette that sold in the third lot for $58,000, or for the Jaguar E-Type that drew appreciative applause from the VIP section when the final bid reached $85,000. He was not here for any of the vehicles that occupied the first 20 lots on the program. He was here for lot 22. He had drawn a small pencil circle around it 3 days earlier, sitting at his kitchen table with the auction catalog and a cup of coffee that had gone cold while he read the vehicle description 3 times. His hand had been steady when he made the circle. He had known what he was looking at before he confirmed the number. He had confirmed the number anyway, carefully twice, because a thing like this required certainty before it required action. The hall shifted register when the floor crew pushed lot 22 into position under the overhead lights. The auctioneer, who had been moving through the afternoon with practiced energy, allowed his voice to flatten slightly as he ran through the vehicle report. Several people in the front rows stood and stretched. A woman in the VIP section checked her phone. A man to her left leaned over and said something that made 2 people nearby smile. The car on the platform had not been kind to the years. A 1967 Ford Mustang fastback, according to the catalog. According to the eyes, something else entirely. The paint had failed across most of the body surface, leaving wide patches of gray primer and bare metal beneath. The front bumper was cracked and detached at the right corner. The windshield carried a diagonal fracture that ran from the lower left to the upper right, as though the glass had been making a decision and had not finished making it. The roof panel showed warping at the rear seam. The interior, visible through the side window, had been partially consumed by moisture and by time, both of which are indifferent to the value of what they work on. The auctioneer set the opening bid at $200. The room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when no one intends to speak. He repeated the figure. The quiet continued. Then Marcus raised his paddle. "500, he said. The auctioneer paused. "Sir, the opening is 200. You can start there." "500, Marcus said again. Zoe patted the top of his head. "Did we get it, Dad?" The laughter came from the VIP section first. Not the subtle kind, the kind that was meant to be heard. A man named Preston Weld, seated 3 chairs to the left of Victoria Hargrove, and wearing a suit that had cost more than Marcus paid in monthly rent, laughed in the generous way of someone who has found something genuinely funny and wants to share it with the room. Several people nearby joined him, the laughter spreading through the section in the quick, easy way that laughter spreads when it requires no personal investment. Victoria Hargrove did not turn her head all the way toward Marcus. She looked in his direction at the car on the platform, and then at him, And then she spoke at a volume calculated for the surrounding seats to hear without her needing to raise her voice. $500. What exactly are you planning to do with a pile of scrap? The laughter widened. It was not the laughter of cruelty in its direct form. It was the laughter of people who had never needed to think carefully about $500 and who could not construct a reason why a man in work clothes with a child on his shoulders would spend it on something that needed to be dragged off the floor of a storage unit. It was dismissal arranged into amusement. It was the sound of people who had never been wrong about this kind of thing and who saw no reason to start considering the possibility. Marcus did not look at Victoria. He looked at Zoe, who had not fully understood the laughter, but who had, with the precise instinct of a child who has learned to read her father's face before she reads a room, understood that his face was calm, and so she stayed calm too. She trusted his face over the noise of the room. She had learned in the particular education that a child receives from a parent who has faced difficult rooms without flinching that this was the correct way to navigate. The gavel came down. Marcus Hayes was the new owner of the 1967 Ford Mustang Fastback Lot 22 for $500. He carried Zoe on his shoulders out of the hall the same way he had carried her in his program folded under his arm, his expression settled in private. People moved out of his way without particularly noticing they were doing it. In the parking lot, he strapped Zoe into the back seat of his truck and stood for a moment with the driver door open looking back at the convention hall. The October air moved through the lot and stirred a few loose leaves along the curb. He got in the truck. He did not say anything for a long time. From the back seat, Zoe asked whether the car was really as broken as it looked. Pretty broken, Marcus agreed. Can you fix it? He looked at her in the rearview mirror. She had her program open on her lap, the purple marker uncapped in her hand, and she was watching him with the focused patience of a child who already knows the answer and wants to hear him say it. Everything is fixable, he said. You just have to know where to start. She capped a Schweimer marker and looked out the window at the parking lot moving past. She appeared satisfied with this. She did not ask a follow-up question. She understood that this was the kind of statement that contained its own completion. That night, after Zoe was asleep, Marcus went to the kitchen table and sat down with a wooden box he had kept on the high shelf of the closet for 3 years. He set it on the table and opened it carefully the way a person opens something that has been waiting. Inside the box was a manila envelope, and inside the envelope were documents. An original title, a build sheet with factory specifications typed in columns on paper that had yellowed at the margins, a window sticker with the factory paint code printed in ink that had faded but not disappeared. On the build sheet, in a column for exterior color, someone had typed a single notation in letters that were still legible if you held the paper at the right angle toward the light. Acapulco blue. There was also a photograph, black and white, printed on paper that had softened at the edges with age. It showed a man in his late 20s standing beside a car in front of a garage somewhere flat and open, the land stretching out behind the building in the way that Alabama land stretches in summer, without interruption, under a sky that had the quality of something that had decided to be enormous and had succeeded. The car in the photograph was a Ford Mustang Fastback, and even in black and white, the paint had the depth of something that had been chosen with intention, with care, with the specific investment of a person for whom the choice meant more than the object alone. The man standing beside the car had one hand resting on the roof and was squinting slightly into the sun. He looked like a man who had earned something and was not yet entirely used to the fact of having it. The way a person looks when they are still waiting for something to tell them, the good thing is allowed to stay. The man was Earl Hayes, Marcus's grandfather. The year was 1967. The vehicle identification number on the title in the envelope matched the number on the frame of Lot 22 at the Harwell Convention Center. Marcus had confirmed the match from the auction catalog before he had driven to Harwell. He had confirmed it again at his kitchen table the night before, holding the build sheet under the lamp with the catalog description beside it, reading the two sets of numbers against each other with the care of a man who needs to be certain before he acts. He had confirmed it a third time when the car rolled under the lights in the auction hall, and he had been standing in the side aisle with his daughter on his shoulders and the number in his memory and the confirmation in his chest before the auctioneer had finished reading the vehicle report. This was not a random Mustang. This was Earl's car. Earl Hayes had bought the car new from a dealership in Birmingham, Alabama, in the spring of 1967. He had been 26 years old, a welder at a pipe manufacturing plant on the south side of the city, and he had been saving for 3 years to buy the thing he had decided he was going to buy. In 1967, in Birmingham, a black man walking into a car dealership and putting money down on a new vehicle was not a simple transaction. The dealership had made him wait in a chair near the door for 45 minutes before a salesman acknowledged him. The finance office had asked him questions that had nothing to do with his ability to pay and everything to do with the fact of who he was in a city that had decided what people who looked like him were permitted to want. Earl had answered every question. He had signed every document. He had placed the certified check on the counter without a word and had taken the keys from the salesman's hand and had walked out of that dealership in the afternoon light and gotten into his car and driven away from the lot, and he had not stopped smiling for 2 weeks. He had told Marcus the story once on a Sunday afternoon when Marcus was 12, and they were sitting in Earl's garage in Harwell looking at an engine that needed work. Earl had told it the way he told all important things without performance, quietly as if the facts themselves were sufficient and required no decoration from the person delivering them. They told me a man like me had no business owning something that fine, Earl had said. He was handing Marcus a socket wrench when he said it, not looking at him, but at the engine block in front of them, his voice even and unhurried. I decided they were wrong about that. I bought it anyway. The car was proof that they were wrong. Every time I drove it, it was proof. Earl had sold the car in 1989. Hurricane Hugo had come through the region and taken employment with it, and the plant had reduced its workforce by a third, and Earl had been among those let go, and the family had needed money more than it needed the proof. He had spoken of the car after that with the specific restraint of a man who has made a necessary sacrifice and has elected not to burden the people around him with his feelings about what it cost. He mentioned it rarely. When he did, his eyes moved in a way that Marcus had learned to recognize over years of watching his grandfather, a slight shift of the gaze before he changed the subject, as if the thing he was looking at briefly was located somewhere further away than the room he was standing in. He had never said he regretted it. He had never had to. Marcus sat at the kitchen table for a long time with the photograph and the documents spread in front of him, the lamp making a warm circle on the table, and the rest of the kitchen in shadow, and the house quiet around him in the way a house is quiet when a child is sleeping somewhere inside it. In the spring of 2009, when Zoe was 2 years old, Marcus's wife Simone had been killed in a car accident on the highway outside Atlanta on a Friday night in November. She had been driving home from her sister's house in the rain. The driver who crossed the center line sustained minor injuries. Marcus had been in their kitchen doing the dishes when his phone rang on the counter beside the sink, and he had picked it up with wet hands, and the world had changed in the specific way it changes when something that cannot be undone has been done, not gradually and not with warning, but all at once, completely, the floor staying exactly where it had always been while everything above it shifted. For 14 months after Simone died, he had continued driving the 2 hours each way to Hollowell Classic Works, the restoration workshop in the eastern part of the state, where he had risen from junior technician at 22 to head of the restoration department before his 30th birthday. His colleagues had called him the doctor, not because he was formal or distant, but because of what happened when he listened to an engine. He could sit beside a running motor for 45 seconds and tell you what was wrong with it before he opened the hood, reading the sound, the way a doctor reads a pulse, finding in the specific qualities of the noise, the information that other people missed. The name had followed him through 7 years of work that included projects for the Smithsonian Institution documentation packages for Christie's auction house in London, and a private collection restoration in Monaco, where an independent evaluator had submitted a formal report describing his completed work on a 1961 Ferrari as technically and historically the most faithful restoration of its kind completed in the preceding 15 years. He had kept working after Simone died because the work was what he knew how to do, and doing it kept his hands occupied and his mind directed outward at problems that had solutions, which was preferable to directing it inward at the problem that did not. He had kept coming home after dark to a daughter who needed him present in a way that the long drive and the long days were not permitting him to be. He had kept offering Zoe a version of himself that was functional in most of the ways that mattered and hollow in some of the ways that mattered more. And for 14 months, he had told himself that this was the best he could do and that it would be enough. It was Zoe who made the decision in the way children make decisions without knowing that is what they are doing. She did not ask him to stay. She did not say she needed more. She simply needed more visibly daily in the specific ways that a 2-year-old becoming a 3-year-old needs a parent who is physically and emotionally present rather than physically absent and emotionally elsewhere. And Marcus had watched her needing it and had understood what the watching was telling him. On a Tuesday in March 2011, he had submitted his resignation at Hollowell. He found a position at a smaller garage on the west side of Harwell. The work was honest and the scale was modest, and the hours allowed him to be home by dinner and to sit at the kitchen table while Zoe did homework and to be there in the way she needed him to be there. His reputation in Harwell was quiet but solid among the people in the city's small, classic car community. The people who knew that world knew his name and what it meant. The people who did not know that world looked at his garage on Clement Street and saw a man in work clothes running a modest operation and formed their assessment and moved on, which was usually the end of the assessment. He pulled a legal pad toward him and uncapped a pen. 30 days, he wrote at the top of the page. Below that, he wrote the schedule in the careful, methodical way he had always planned. Restoration work breaking the total into stages, and the stages into days, and the days into tasks, with enough specificity to be useful and enough flexibility to accommodate what the car itself would reveal once the work began. 5 days of disassembly, 3 days of cleaning and cataloging and assessment, 10 days of part sourcing and mechanical rebuild, 7 days of bodywork, 4 days of paint preparation and application, 2 days of interior and trim, 2 days of final assembly systems, verification, and road test. 30 days. The math was possible. It would require early mornings and late nights and a discipline about time that left no room for error and no tolerance for the kind of delay that comes from working on problems in the wrong order. But it was possible. He had worked on tighter schedules with more damaged vehicles. He knew how to do this. He had always known how to do this. He looked at the photograph of Earl Hayes for a long time before he turned off the kitchen light. Earl at 26, hand on the roof of the car, in the Alabama sun, the expression of a man who has paid for something with more than money and is still holding the receipt and learning what it means to have it. Marcus went to bed. He lay in the dark listening to the house settle and thought about what the car had been and what it was now and what he was going to make it into again, and at some point the thinking became sleep. The flatbed arrived before 8 the following morning. A few neighbors paused on the sidewalk to watch the Mustang come down off the truck and into the garage on Clement Street. In daylight, the car looked worse than it had under the auction hall lights, which was saying something. The paint failure was more extensive than it appeared under the overhead fluorescence. The oxidation on the chrome was more complete. The deformation in the right quarter panel was more pronounced. The car sat in the center of the garage and had about it the quality of something that had been waiting for a long time and had slowly given up on what it was waiting for. Darnell Webb pulled up 20 minutes later in his pickup. Darnell was 38, built wide through the shoulders, a man who had worked alongside Marcus at Hollowell for 2 years before Marcus left, and who had since built his own upholstery and trim shop on the east side of Harwell, into a business that the serious people in the regional restoration community knew and used. They had stayed close in the unceremonious way that men who have worked well together stay close through occasional calls and visits, and the understanding that a friendship of that kind requires no active maintenance to remain sound. He walked around the Mustang twice without speaking. He crouched to look under the frame rail on the driver's side. He stood and walked to the passenger side and ran his fingers along the deformed section of the rear quarter panel. He opened the driver door and looked at the interior briefly, then straightened up and looked at Marcus. "You are serious about this," he said. It was not entirely a question. 30 days, Marcus said. Darnell appeared to perform an internal calculation. He looked at the car again. Whatever result he arrived at, it settled something in his expression. He took off his jacket and hung it on a nail by the garage wall. "I am here on weekends. I will not take money for it." Marcus nodded once. That was sufficient. They both understood what kind of agreement had just been made. Marcus spent the entire first day not touching the car with tools. This was how he had always begun. The assessment came before the work, and the assessment had to be thorough and honest, had to be conducted without the bias of wanting to find something salvageable and without the bias of expecting to find something beyond saving. He moved around the Mustang slowly for hours, pressing his fingers against panels, testing hinges for play, lifting sections of trim to examine what was beneath. Looking at the underside with a work light, reading the car, the way he had always read cars, with attention first and instruments second. What the assessment told him changed the picture considerably. The chassis was sound, not merely acceptable for a car that had been sitting in a Kentucky storage unit for an estimated 22 years. Genuinely structurally sound. The frame rails showed no significant bending. The structural members showed no meaningful corrosion in the places where corrosion in those members would have ended the project. For a car that had been stationary and neglected for more than 2 decades, this was the discovery that a restorer recognizes without needing to announce, the specific recognition that comes from experience of knowing how often this kind of car presents this kind of good news and how grateful you are when it does. The car had been abandoned. It had not been mistreated. The distinction mattered more than it might appear. The body panels were another story entirely. Surface rust across most of the exterior. Deformation in the right quarter panel that would require heating and reforming work across multiple sessions. Paint failure that was complete and comprehensive and had left the body looking like something that had been disagreeing with the weather for 20 years and losing. But the structure beneath the surface was honest. The skeleton was worth saving and worth the work it was going to take. The engine was a 390 cubic inch FE block, one of the more powerful options Ford had offered on the 1967 Fastback. It had been comprehensively neglected. The carburetor was gummed past the point of cleaning. The valve cover gaskets had failed. The timing chain had slackened over the decades of stillness. The fuel system required complete rebuilding. But when Marcus removed the valve covers and looked inside with the light, the cylinder walls were not scored. The block had not cracked. It was a damaged engine. It was not a dead one. There was still something to work with, and Marcus knew how to work with it. He found the note on the second day when he removed the instrument cluster. It was tucked behind the dash panel, pressed into the space between the back of the cluster and the firewall, folded once with the clean fold of something placed deliberately rather than wedged hastily. The paper had aged in that space for a long time, and the ballpoint ink had bled slightly into the fibers over the years, but the writing was legible. It was precise and unhurried, the handwriting of someone who wrote carefully because he understood that what he was writing was meant to last. 4 words, a location, a year, a name. Harwell, Alabama, 1967. Earl Hayes. Marcus stood still in the garage for a long time with the folded paper in his hand. Outside on Clement Street, a car passed. Down the block, a lawnmower started up and ran for a while and then stopped. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary Tuesday moved around the garage, and Marcus stood inside a stillness that was not ordinary at all, holding something his grandfather had placed inside this car 58 years ago, when he was a young man in Birmingham who had been told what he was not permitted to own and had purchased it anyway, and had put his name inside it in a place where his name would travel with the car wherever the car went. He put the note in his wallet, folded carefully next to his driver's license. That evening he called his grandfather. Earl picked up on the 3rd ring, his voice measured in the way it always was when he was not certain who was calling. "I found it," Marcus said. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that Marcus checked the signal on his phone, looking at the bars in the corner of the screen. Then Earl said very quietly, "Where?" "Harwell. It came through an auction. I do not know the full path before that." Another silence longer than the first. "Is it bad?" "It is bad." Marcus looked at the Mustang through the kitchen doorway visible in the garage under the overhead light. "But it is all there." Earl did not respond for a moment. When he did, his voice had changed in the way that voices change when a person is managing something they were not prepared to manage in that particular moment. "You bringing it back?" "I am bringing it back." A pause. Then his grandfather said, "All right," he said nothing else. It was enough. In those 2 words delivered in that voice at that hour, Marcus heard everything that did not need to be said between them. He hung up and stood at the kitchen window looking at the garage and the light inside it. Zoe was asleep. The house was quiet. He went back out to the garage and stood in front of the car for a long time, not with the eyes of a man facing a problem, but with the eyes of a man who already knows what needs to be done and is taking the necessary moment before he begins. He thought about Earl in Birmingham in 1967, driving this car through the streets of a city that had opinions about what men who looked like Earl were allowed to have. He thought about what the car had meant in those years, not merely as transportation, but as a statement made in metal and paint, in the specific costly refusal to accept a ceiling that other people had decided was appropriate. A black man in a car that fine in Alabama in 1967 was saying something every time he drove it. Every time Earl pulled out of his driveway and onto the street, he was saying something. The car was the saying of it. He thought about Simone, who had a way of arriving at the essential truth of things without apparent effort. She had stood in the doorway of the Hollowell workshop once watching Marcus 3 hours into disassembling a transmission and had said simply, "You do this like it is a form of prayer." He had laughed and said that was too much. And she had said, "No, it is not." And she had been right. As she was right about most things, she said quietly and without qualification. Marcus picked up the legal pad and looked at the schedule. 30 days. He went to work. The parts were the problem he had known would be the problem. Original specification components for a 1967 Ford Mustang were not impossible to source. They were available distributed across a network of specialty suppliers and private collections and salvage operations that Marcus had spent nearly a decade building relationships inside of during his years at Hollowell. But sourcing the correct pieces, period accurate and mechanically sound, and documented where documentation mattered, required time and knowledge, and the specific credibility that comes from years of serious work in a field where serious people know each other. Marcus had the knowledge and the credibility. He had less time than he would have preferred. He made 11 phone calls on the first evening. He left messages with suppliers in Atlanta, Charlotte, and a man in northern Ohio who had been holding a matched set of valve train components for a 3900 FE block for 2 years, waiting for a buyer who would understand what he was selling. He called a chrome restoration shop in Savannah that he had worked with during his Hollowell years, a shop run by a man named Theodore who could look at oxidized chrome and tell you in 30 seconds whether it could be returned to original specification or needed to be replaced, and who had never been wrong about it in Marcus's experience. He called 2 upholstery material suppliers. Both knew his name. Both confirmed they could source period-correct black vinyl to the 1967 Ford specification within a window that the schedule could accommodate. By the end of the second day, he had commitments for the major mechanical components. By the end of the third day, the delivery windows were confirmed and the schedule remained intact. Uncomfortable, but intact. On the 6th day, he drove to Callaway Auto Supply on the north side of Harwell to source gaskets and a carburetor rebuild kit. Douglas Callaway had been running the same store in the same building since 1981 and had been selling parts to serious mechanics for so long that he had developed the particular reading ability of a person whose livelihood depends on distinguishing the careful from the casual within the first minute of a conversation. He gave better pricing to the people who earned it and did not explain the differential to the people who did not receive it. Marcus had an account there from his Hollowell years that had remained active and a reputation that Douglas recognized when Marcus used his name. Marcus was standing at the Mustang component rack reading the specification panel on a carburetor kit when he heard the door open behind him. He registered the sound and continued reading. Victoria Hargrove walked to the counter and spoke with Douglas about a heritage display component for a launch event her company was preparing. It was a period-accurate piece for a promotional photograph connected to a new sedan model that Hargrove Automotive Group was bringing to market. She was precise about what she needed and spoke at the measured pace of someone who is accustomed to being the most prepared person in any given professional exchange. Douglas listened and answered with the thoroughness of a man who takes all requests seriously regardless of the status of the person making them. Then Douglas looked past her at Marcus in the easy and unprompted way of a man who has been holding conversations in his store for 4 decades and sees no particular reason to stop. "You know," Douglas said, "the gentleman over at the Mustang rack there did restoration work for the Smithsonian Institution. Christie's London as well, if I am recalling correctly." Victoria turned. She looked at Marcus. He had not turned around completely. He was still reading the back of the carburetor kit, reading the specification with the focused attention of someone who actually understands the numbers. And what she saw was the sight of a man in work clothes doing something with his full attention. He glanced at Douglas and nodded once in acknowledgement and went back to reading. Victoria bought what she needed and walked out. On the sidewalk outside the glass door, she stopped. She stood for a moment looking at her card at the curb and then back through the glass at the man at the parts rack. She had not connected him to the auction, not until Douglas said the name. Then she had. Hayes. 2 years earlier, at an industry conference in Charleston, she had been part of a conversation about provenance documentation for a vehicle that had sold at private auction for $1.4 million. The restoration work that had supported the provenance claim had been conducted by someone at Hollowell Classic Works. The name attached to the report had been Hayes. She sat in her car without starting it for a moment. Then she drove back to her office. That afternoon, she asked her assistant to compile whatever professional record existed for a Marcus Hayes, formerly of Hollowell Classic Works, currently operating somewhere in Harwell. What came back that evening was a document that required 2 readings. The Smithsonian project was there, the Christie's documentation, the Monaco collection, where an independent evaluator had formally described a completed restoration as technically and historically the most faithful work of its kind completed in the preceding 15 years. Exhibition citations, professional references from 2 international auction houses that used specific language about the quality and reliability of the documentation he provided. A photograph from a national automotive restoration publication showing a man in a workshop with the components of a disassembled 1961 Ferrari laid out around him in the precise organized arrangement of someone who thinks in complete systems. The man in the photograph was the man she had seen at the auction. The man who had stood in the side aisle in work clothes with a 7-year-old on his shoulders and raised a paddle for $500 and had not said a word when the VIP section laughed at him. Victoria sat with the document on her screen for a long time. Through her office window, the Harwell skyline settled into evening, the lights in the buildings across the street coming on one by one, in the way lights come on in a city at the end of a day. She thought about what she had said at the auction. She had said it without hesitation. She had looked at a man and assessed him in the space of 2 seconds and delivered her assessment in a voice calculated to carry to the surrounding seats, and she had been wrong. Not in the way of making a careless remark, but in the way of performing an assessment with confidence before she had done the work that an assessment requires. And she had done it in front of his daughter. She closed the document. She went back to her work. But the document stayed with her in the way that certain things stay when they have moved something that does not want to acknowledge being moved. Preston Weld stopped in her doorway late that afternoon. He had heard through someone at the convention center that the man from the auction was actually working on the Mustang, that it was in a garage in Harwell somewhere. He smiled when he said it, the reflexive smile of someone expecting the story to continue in the direction it had started. Victoria did not smile. Who was he, she said, before the garage. Preston did not understand the question. He left without pressing it, reading something in her expression that suggested the conversation was not going where he had assumed it was going. Victoria looked at the professional record on her screen one more time. Then she closed her computer and sat for a moment in the quiet of her office. Then she picked up her personal phone and made a call that she did not discuss with anyone. The days inside the garage on Clement Street did not announce themselves as significant while they were happening. They were made of early mornings and coffee that went cold on the workbench and the particular silence that belongs to a space where a person is doing something they know how to do completely, without audience and without uncertainty about the direction they are going. Marcus worked through the disassembly with methodical care. Every component removed was labeled and photographed and placed in the sequence of its removal. Nothing was discarded before being examined. Nothing was treated as obviously beyond saving until it had been examined and found to be so. Zoe came to the garage after school each afternoon and did her homework on a folding table near the rear wall. She had brought a lamp from her room to supplement the overhead light because she had determined that the overhead light alone was insufficient for reading small print, and she had arranged her books and pencils on the folding table with the organization of a person who takes her work seriously, regardless of the environment in which it is being done. Occasionally, she would look up from her homework and ask the name of a component or make an observation that she delivered with the seriousness of a person offering professional input. On a Wednesday evening during the second week, she held up a paint chip she had found on the floor next to the passenger door. "The color is wrong," she said. Marcus looked at the chip. It was a fragment of the original paint that had not yet been stripped, a remnant of the failed surface from the lower section of the door panel. What color do you think it should be? She set the chip on the table and thought about this with the gravity of a 7-year-old who has been asked a real question and intends to answer it correctly. Blue, she said, like in Grandpa's picture. Darker, like the ocean at nighttime. Marcus looked at her. He looked at the paint chip. That is exactly right, he said. The paint was the problem he had been carrying in the back of his thinking since the beginning of the project, because it was the problem that could not be solved by sourcing a part from a supplier or sending a component out for chrome restoration. It had to be solved from primary materials, and it had to be done correctly because the paint was what people saw, the paint was what the eye went to first, and a car restored to correct mechanical specification. But wearing an approximate color is not a restoration. It is a very expensive approximation. Acapulco blue, the factory color listed on Earl's original build sheet, had been a Mustang option for model years 1967 and 1968. Ford's original formula existed in technical documentation that Marcus had located in the binder he kept from his Hollowell years, a collection of factory color specifications and mixing ratios and technical reference materials assembled over nearly a decade of serious restoration work. The formula was on page 47 of the binder cross-referenced against a DuPont product code that had been discontinued in 1991. The formula existed. The problem was that the dyes had shifted since the 1960s in the ways that pigments and dyes shift over 60 years of industrial production and reformulation, and no commercial paint supplier in Harwell could take that formula and produce a result that matched the reference chip from the original catalog with the precision the job required. He spent an evening on the phone with 3 specialty shops in 2 cities. None of them could hit the formula accurately enough. Darnell borrowed a spectrophotometer from a colleague in the automotive finishing trade, and Marcus spent 2 days in careful trial and adjustment, mixing test panels and comparing them against the reference chip under different light conditions at different times of day. The archived formula was the foundation. The calibration data from the spectrophotometer was the architecture. The adjustment work was the craft that sat at the intersection of knowledge and patience, and Marcus had both in the quantities the problem required. When he held the finished test panel next to the photograph of Earl standing beside the car in Birmingham in the afternoon light of 1967, reading the depth and quality of the finish against the tonal range of the image, the match was as close as a black and white photograph from 58 years ago could confirm. The color had a depth to it, a quality of holding light rather than simply reflecting it that was recognizable in the test panel and visible in the photograph if you knew how to read a black and white image for what it was saying about color. Darnell picked up the test panel, held it at arm's length in the garage doorway where the natural light came in, and did not speak for a long moment. "Marcus," he finally said. He set the panel down. He looked at it once more. Then he said, "Victoria Hargrove is going to see this car at some point. You understand that?" Marcus did not answer. He was already setting up the spray booth. The engine came together during the 2nd and 3rd weeks, the way complex mechanical work comes together when the person doing it has spent 20 years learning the work from the inside out. Not without difficulty, not without problems that required thinking through before they were solved, but without uncertainty about the direction of the work and without any inclination to take the shortcut available at any point where a shortcut was available, because the shortcuts were always visible to Marcus and he had never once been tempted by them. The quality of work that no one would be able to see was the quality of work that mattered most. This was not philosophy. This was mechanics. If the thing beneath the surface is not right, the surface does not matter. He replaced every component that required replacement and reconditioned every component that could be returned to its original specification with careful attention. The 390 FE block was cleaned and honed and reassembled with a level of care that would not be visible to someone looking at the finished engine bay from the outside, but that would be audible completely and immediately audible to anyone who stood beside the running engine and listened to what it was doing. On the 14th evening, he turned the key in the ignition for the first time. The engine caught on the 2nd attempt. The idle was rough and uneven in the first moments, cycling through several adjustments before settling over the course of 40 seconds into something more consistent. The carburetor needed work. The timing was not yet where it needed to be, but the engine was running. A 390 cubic inch FE block that had not started in more than 2 decades was running in a garage on Clement Street in Harwell, Georgia at 11:40 in the evening, and the sound it was making was the sound of something that had not yet found its correct voice, but was in the process of finding it. Darnell put both hands on top of his head and looked at the ceiling and did not speak. Zoe, who had fallen asleep at the homework table with her cheek on her geography textbook and the purple marker still loosely held in her hand, lifted her head at the sound. Her eyes were only partially open, and her voice had the specific quality of someone still mostly inside a dream. "Did the car say something?" she asked. Marcus looked over at her from the driver's seat. "It said it remembered us." She received this without apparent skepticism, laid her head back on the geography book, and returned to sleep. Darnell looked at her and then at Marcus. Marcus turned back to the engine and began adjusting the carburetor. The work after that moved in its own rhythm. The bodywork occupied the better part of a week, the right quarter panel requiring heating and reforming work across 3 separate sessions before the surface reached the standard Marcus applied to everything, which was the standard of running a bare hand across the panel in low light, with your eyes closed and feeling nothing that should not be there. The rust treatment was methodical and thorough. The primer went on in 3 stages, each allowed to cure fully before the next was applied. No step was shortened because the schedule was pressing, which it was pressing continuously from the first day to the last. But Marcus had worked on pressing schedules before, and he knew that the way to meet them was to do each thing correctly and in the right order, not to do things quickly and in the wrong order. On the 12th day, the engine failed to start for the 3rd consecutive attempt. Darnell had gone home. It was past midnight. The carburetor adjustment that had appeared correct the previous evening had produced a fuel mixture that was not correct, and the correction Marcus had made before Darnell left had not resolved it, and the car sat in the center of the garage and did not start. And the legal pad on the workbench said 30 days with the neutrality of a number that does not negotiate. Marcus sat down on the garage floor with his back against the tool cabinet. The overhead light was on. The garage held the smell of oil and primer and the specific metallic quality of a space that has been worked hard for nearly 2 weeks. Through the open side door, the street outside was quiet. No cars on Clement Street at this hour. No sound from the neighborhood, just the ordinary quiet of a residential street in the small hours. He looked at the Mustang. He looked at the photograph of Earl that he had taped to the garage wall at the start of the first week. Earl, at 26, hand on the roof of the car, squinting into the Alabama sun, the expression of a man who had been told what was not available to him and had found the telling incorrect. He thought about the auction hall, about standing in the side aisle with Zoe on his shoulders and the laughter moving through the VIP section and Victoria Hargrove's voice carrying across the room. $500. What exactly are you planning to do with a pile of scrap? He had kept his face still because Zoe was reading his face. He had kept it still because he had learned a long time ago that keeping still in a room that expects you to react is sometimes the most significant thing a man can do. He had learned this from Earl, who had sat in a chair near the door of a Birmingham dealership in 1967 and waited 45 minutes for a salesman to acknowledge him and had not moved and had not raised his voice and had at the end of it driven away in the car he came to buy. He thought about Simone, about the specific ways she had been certain of things, particularly certain of him, in a way that had always seemed to Marcus like more than he had earned, but that she had never appeared to view as anything other than accurate. She had stood in the doorway of the Hollowell workshop once watching him work and had said that he did this like it was a form of prayer. He had told her that was too much. She had said, "No, it is not." She had been right. She had been right about most things she said with that particular quiet certainty, and the things she had said were still in him, still available to him on nights like this one, still doing the work they had done when she was alive. He got off the floor. He picked up the carburetor tool and went back to the engine. The problem was a secondary circuit float height set 2 millimeters high on the initial calibration. The correction took 40 minutes. At 1:37 in the morning, the engine turned over, caught, and settled into an idle that was smooth and even and correct. Not almost correct, correct. He sat in the driver's seat for a few minutes with the engine running, not adjusting anything, just listening to it. The sound it was making now was the sound it was supposed to be making. He could hear that it was right. The specific quality of a correctly timed, correctly tuned 390 FE block running on a rebuilt carburetor in a rebuilt fuel system was recognizable to him, the way a familiar voice is recognizable, and what he was hearing was right. He reached into his shirt pocket and took out his wallet. He found the folded note where he had placed it against his driver's license and unfolded it carefully on the steering wheel in the light of the dash. Harwell, Alabama, 1967. Earl Hayes. His grandfather had pressed those words into the paper and folded it and tucked it behind the instrument cluster of this car 58 years ago, when he was a young welder in Birmingham who had purchased the thing he was told he had no business purchasing, and he had placed his name inside it so that wherever the car went, his name went with it. Inside it in the specific private location that only a person who took the car apart would ever find. It was the act of a man making a claim in a time and place when the claim required more courage than it should have required. Marcus folded the note and put it back in his wallet. He sat in the running car for another minute. Then he turned the engine off and went to bed. He called Earl the following evening. Earl picked up on the third ring. "I found something," Marcus said. "In the car, behind the dash." A pause on the line. "You left a note," Marcus said. The silence that followed was longer than the pauses that had preceded it. "I figured it would go with the Cairn," Earl said finally. His voice was even in the way it was even when he was managing something that mattered. "Wherever it ended up, least my name would be in it." Marcus looked at the kitchen wall at a crayon drawing Zoe had taped there the previous week, 4 wheels of unequal size beneath a blue rectangle that was meant to be a car. "Your name is still in it," he said. Earl did not respond immediately. When he did, what he said was quiet enough that Marcus had to listen carefully. "You bringing it home, I am bringing it home," Earl said. "All right." And in those 2 words delivered in that voice, Marcus heard the full weight of 35 years of not saying what it had cost. On day 26, the Acapulco Blue went on. Marcus sprayed the first coat in the afternoon when the temperature in the garage and the humidity of the October air had reached the conditions the formula required. He had been monitoring both since morning. The surface preparation was complete. Every step that preceded this moment had been done correctly and in the right order, which meant this step could be done correctly, which was always how it worked, the quality of each stage depending on the integrity of everything beneath it. The color came down over the bodywork the way a fact settles after long uncertainty. Not as a surprise, but as a confirmation of something that was already true waiting to be made visible. The deep blue, with its subtle metallic element in the formula, held the garage light with a quality that Marcus recognized immediately. The depth of it, the way it received light and held it rather than throwing it back. He had mixed this formula from a document 40 years old and a measuring instrument borrowed from a man he had called in a favor from, and the result was the color that Earl Hayes had chosen from a sample book in a Birmingham dealership in the spring of 1967, standing at a counter where a salesman had made him wait, looking at the samples with the patience of a man who had decided exactly what he was going to have. He sprayed the second coat the following morning. When it was done, he stood back from the car and looked at it for a long time. The garage was very quiet. Outside, the morning moved along Clement Street, people driving to work, a neighbor's dog, the sound of the city beginning its day. Inside the garage, the Mustang stood in the Acapulco Blue that had been on it originally, the color it had worn when Earl drove it off the lot, and when Earl drove it through the streets of Birmingham, and when it had meant everything that it had meant in those years, and Marcus stood looking at it for a long time before he picked up his tools. Darnell arrived on day 27 for the buffing and final surface work. He pulled into the driveway and walked into the garage and stopped in the doorway. He did not speak for what Marcus estimated was close to a full minute. He stood in the doorway looking at the car, and whatever he was experiencing in that minute, it was sufficient to hold him completely still without any apparent effort. "Say something," Marcus said. Darnell shook his head slowly. He was looking at the car with the expression of someone who has done a great deal of good professional work over many years and has encountered infrequently enough to still be capable of surprise a result that is genuinely beyond what he had understood the situation to be capable of producing. "I'm trying to find the right word," Darnell said. "Give me a minute." He never arrived at one. He put on his gloves and started on the buffing, and the absence of a word turned out to be sufficient. The interior work occupied the final days. Marcus had sourced period-correct materials for the seat upholstery through the supplier he had called in the first week, a close specification match to the original black vinyl Ford had used in the 1967 fastback interior. He installed the door panel's carpet and dashboard components with the same attention he had applied to every preceding stage of the work. The instrument cluster went in last. Before he secured it, he stopped. He looked at the back of the panel, the surface that faced the firewall, the surface that no one would see after the cluster was installed. The carved initials were there where Earl had put them at some point during those first months of ownership in 1967. two letters pressed into the material with something sharp, small, and deliberate, the signature of a man putting his name on something he had paid for in more than money. Marcus had seen them the first time he removed the cluster. He had known then what he was going to do about them. He did nothing about them. He cleaned the area around them carefully and put the instrument cluster back into the car exactly as it was, the carved initials in the position they had occupied since 1967. They were not a flaw to be corrected. They were a signature to be preserved. The car had Earl's name inside it, and Marcus was not going to be the person who removed it. On day 29, a letter arrived from the Harwell Vintage Automotive Showcase, the city's largest annual classic car exhibition held every year at Harwell Convention Park in October. The letter was from the organizing board. It said that the showcase would be held the coming Saturday and that a display position had been reserved by committee selection for a vehicle recently brought to the board's attention. The letter invited Marcus to present the vehicle in the central exhibition space, a position typically allocated through a formal application process that required advanced submission. Marcus read the letter twice standing at the kitchen counter. Then he showed it to Zoe at the breakfast table. She lowered her cereal spoon. "They want to see our car." "Looks that way." "Is it ready?" Marcus looked toward the garage through the kitchen doorway. "Almost," he said. He did not know who had contacted the showcase on his behalf. He would not learn until much later that Victoria Hargrove had made that call herself 2 days after pulling his professional record from the archive and reading the evaluator's report from the Monaco collection. She had contacted the organizing board through a private channel and described a vehicle of unusual historical and technical significance without identifying herself or her connection to the auction in Harwell. She had suggested without pressure that a central display slot might be warranted for a vehicle and a story of this particular kind. She had returned to her desk and continued her afternoon and had not mentioned the call to Preston Weld or to her assistant or to anyone else at Hargrove Automotive Group. She had made the call and put it behind her. On the final night, Marcus and Darnell completed the last adjustments: the idle mixture, the timing advance, the final torque verification on the suspension components. They finished at 2:14 in the morning. Both men were past the point of tired that has a name and into the territory on the other side of it, the territory that has a specific quality of clarity that comes from having pushed through exhaustion into something quieter on the other side. Marcus sat down on the garage floor with his back against the tool cabinet, the same position he had occupied on night 12 when the engine would not start, and the schedule had looked impossibly short, and the distance between what the car was and what it needed to become had seemed like more than 30 days could contain. Darnell sat across from him near the door. Neither of them spoke for a while, the kind of silence that does not require filling. The Mustang stood in the center of the garage under the overhead lights, the Acapulco blue holding the fluorescent light with the same unhurried depth it had held it in the afternoon, the chrome trim reflecting with the clarity of something made right, not merely polished. The fastback roofline moving from the A-pillars to the rear deck with the proportion that Ford's designers had arrived at in 1966, and that looked in this garage in October as correct as the day the first one came off the assembly line in Dearborn. Every surface was right. Every line was where it was supposed to be. The car was as faithful to its original specification as 30 years of restoration experience could make it in 30 days. Darnell picked up his jacket from the nail by the door. He stood looking at the car. 30 days, he said, from $500. Marcus looked at the photograph of Earl Hayes still taped to the garage wall, slightly curled at one corner from 3 weeks of temperature variation. "I brought it home," Marcus said. Darnell looked at Marcus. He looked at the car once more. He put on his jacket and walked out. Nothing else needed to be said, and neither of them said it. Marcus carried Zoe to bed an hour later. She had woken when the garage light went off, surfacing into partial consciousness with the immediate question of whether the car was finished. "All done," he said. "We are showing it tomorrow." "Good," she said, and she was asleep before he got her settled. The Saturday morning arrived clear and cold, in the particular way of Georgia mornings in October. The air sharp and direct, and the light coming in at the angle that makes paint look its best, and chrome look like something that has been waiting for this specific quality of illumination to show what it actually is. Harwell Convention Park occupied 6 acres on the northern edge of the city, and by 8 in the morning, more than 80 vehicles were arranged across the grounds under white canopy frames, sports cars and touring cars, and pre-war roadsters and muscle cars from the 60s and 70s presented on clean asphalt with the slightly formal arrangement of things that are being offered for the consideration of people who understand what they are looking at. Marcus drove the Mustang from Clement Street to the park himself. This was the first time the car had moved under its own power on a public road. The 395-8 produced exactly the sound it had been built to produce a low and unhurried authority that other drivers noticed at intersections, their heads turning in that involuntary way that certain sounds produce before the brain has completed its decision about whether to pay attention. Marcus drove at the speed limit. He listened to the engine the way he had always listened to engines, not analyzing it anymore, but simply receiving it, finding in the specific qualities of the sound, the confirmation that the work had been done the way it was supposed to be done. Zoe sat in the passenger seat in a denim jacket with her hair in a high ponytail. She was holding the photograph of Earl in her lap with both hands looking at it and then looking out the window at the early morning streets of Harwell moving past. "It is the loudest car on the road," she said. "It is a big engine," Marcus said. "I like it," she said. At the event entrance, the staff directed Marcus to the central exhibition space, a position at the geometric center of the grounds, where the walkways from all 4 entry points converge to the location where the largest number of people would naturally pass. He had not been told in advance where he was being placed. He pulled in and cut the engine, and in the moment of quiet after the motor stopped, a man standing 20 feet away turned to look at the car. Then the man beside him turned. Within 2 minutes, there were a dozen people in a loose arc around the Mustang without anyone having organized them into it. Within 15 minutes, there were 30. Zoe got out of the car and stood next to the front fender, holding the photograph in both hands. A collector named Raymond Aldis, who had been attending the showcase for 19 of its 22 years, and who had been inside the Hollowell Classic Works workshop twice during the years Marcus was running the restoration department, there walked up and spent a long time looking at the car, with the quiet thoroughness of a person who has looked at a great many cars and has learned to distinguish between the ones that have been made to look good and the ones that have been made right, which are not always the same thing and are usually not. He crouched at the rear quarter panel. He walked to the front. He opened the hood and stood looking at the engine bay for what Marcus estimated was 3 full minutes without speaking. Then he straightened up and looked at Marcus. He extended his hand. "Marcus Hayes," he said, "I wondered what you had been doing with yourself." He paused and looked at the car once more. "Now I know." A reporter from the Harwell Tribune was on the grounds covering the showcase for the weekend section. She had received a tip the previous day from someone in the collector community that a vehicle with an unusual story might be worth finding at this year's event. She found the Mustang by following the growing concentration of people toward it. She took photographs and then stood beside Zoe, who was explaining the car's history to a boy of approximately her age, with the confident authority of someone who has been given precise information, has retained it precisely, and considers the responsibility of passing it on to be significant. "This was my great-grandfather's car," Zoe said. "He bought it in 1967 in Birmingham, Alabama. My dad found it and brought it back. It took 30 days. The color is called Acapulco blue." The boy considered this information with apparent seriousness. "What is Acapulco?" Zoe thought about this for a moment. "A very blue place," she said. He accepted this. Victoria Hargrove arrived at the showcase at 10:45 later than she had intended. She came in her capacity as the executive representative of Hargrove Automotive Group, which was a presenting sponsor of the event, and she moved through the grounds with her assistant and 2 members of her communications team with the efficient purposefulness of someone who knows how to be present at events without losing track of why she is there. From 40 yards out, she could see that the central exhibition space had a concentration of people significantly larger and more dense than any other cluster on the grounds. She moved toward it. The crowd parted in the natural way crowds part for someone carrying the physical confidence of a person who expects passage, and then the crowd parted enough for her to see the car. The Acapulco blue stopped her. Not the color alone, though. The color was extraordinary in the October morning light, exactly the depth and quality of the original 1967 specification, in a way that she had sufficient automotive knowledge to recognize as something beyond the ordinary attempt at a period color. What stopped her was the whole of it, the proportions of the fastback roofline against the restored body, the chrome reflecting the light with the clarity of something new rather than something refinished. The engine bay she could see through the open hood, the 390 blocks sitting clean and correct in a way that communicated without requiring explanation that the person who had rebuilt it understood precisely what they were doing. She had seen this car at the auction in this same city 2 weeks earlier. She remembered exactly what it had looked like: the failed paint, the fractured windshield, the bumper detached at one corner, the general impression of something that had been making peace with the end of its useful existence for a long time. What stood in front of her now occupied the same physical category as the thing she had seen on the auction floor and shared the same identification number, but it had been returned to something it had been a long time ago, with a fidelity she would not have judged possible in the interval between then and now. It had been done by someone she had looked at in an auction hall and assessed in 2 seconds and dismissed in a sentence delivered at the volume of a performance. Preston Weld was standing to her left. He had seen the car and then seen Marcus standing beside it and had not spoken. Victoria walked forward through the remaining space between herself and the car. Marcus saw her coming from about 10 steps away. He did not move toward her or away from her. He stood and waited with the stillness he had maintained in the auction hall, the specific stillness of a man who has no investment in what other people decide to do next, and who has learned that waiting is usually more informative than any other available option. She stopped at the front of the car. She looked at it from the nose to the tail with a slow and complete attention that took the measure of every surface and every line without hurrying. Then she looked at Marcus. How long, she said. 30 days. From the car at the auction. There was a pause. She looked at the engine bay again and then back at him. I said something at the auction, she said. Her voice had changed from the register she used in professional settings. The directional precision remained, but the edge beneath it had changed into something that required more to produce something that cost more. It was unkind. To you and to her. She looked at Zoe, who was standing beside her, father looking up at Victoria with the frank and uncomplicated curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to be indirect about her observations. I am sorry, Victoria said. Marcus nodded once. He did not use language to close the distance more quickly than it warranted closing. The nod was the appropriate measure of the acknowledgement, and he left it at that. Zoe said with the complete sincerity of a 7-year-old being entirely honest, that is okay. Dad says mean words usually come from people who have not looked closely enough yet. Victoria looked at the child. Something moved across her face that was not quite a smile and not entirely something else. It was the expression of a person receiving an accurate correction from a direction they were not expecting it to come from and finding that they do not have an immediate response to it. Preston Weld had moved several steps away from the group and was looking at something in the middle distance with the concentrated interest of someone who has decided not to be part of a conversation. When Marcus glanced in his direction, Preston looked at his phone and turned and walked toward the exit without making eye contact with anyone in the vicinity of the car. He did not stop to speak to anyone on his way out. The showcase panel of judges made their announcements at noon under the main canopy near the entrance. The crowd gathered in the way crowds gather at the conclusion of things that have held their attention for a morning, the accumulated investment of several hours of looking, making the announcement feel like the completion of something rather than simply an event. The award for Best in Show went to the 1967 Ford Mustang Fastback Central Exhibition space owner Marcus Hayes. The award for Best Restoration went to the same vehicle. The panel spokesperson read the citation into the microphone. A complete restoration from non-operational condition executed in 30 days using period-correct components and historically faithful techniques representing the highest standard of work the panel had encountered in the showcase's 22-year history. The applause started at the edges of the crowd and moved inward. Zoe jumped from the ground and grabbed her father's hand with both of hers. Marcus stood with his arms at his sides, looking at the podium and then looking at the photograph Zoe was still holding. Earl Hayes at 26, hand on the roof of the car, squinting into the Alabama sun, in the posture of a man who has paid for something with more than money and is not yet entirely used to having the receipt. Marcus had not known that Darnell had driven to Alabama on Thursday morning. Darnell had told him only that he had an errand outside the city and would be back by Saturday morning. He had not provided further detail, and Marcus had not pressed for it, which was the nature of the friendship, each of them understanding when the other had a reason for keeping something to himself. Darnell arrived at the showcase just before noon. He parked at the far end of the lot and walked to the passenger side of his truck and helped someone out. The man was 67 years old, silver-haired, carrying a carved wood cane in his right hand. He was wearing a pressed gray suit and shoes that were slightly formal for an outdoor event, but that had been polished that morning with evident and deliberate care. He moved slowly across the asphalt toward the crowd, his pace measured and unhurried, and people nearby noticed him without knowing why and created space around him without being asked. Earl Hayes came through the edge of the crowd. He saw the car. He stopped. He stood still for a long time, long enough that the people immediately surrounding him began to understand without being told that something of weight was occurring, and they stepped back further, creating more space, the crowd widening around him in the quiet recognition that this moment belonged to someone else. He moved forward slowly through the space toward the car. He raised his right hand and placed it flat on the hood of the Mustang, palm down directly over the engine, in the specific place a man places his hand when the thing beneath it is something he has thought about for a long time and is not expected to touch again. His eyes were red at the edges. Zoe saw him. She crossed the space between them in 4 steps and wrapped both arms around his waist. "Grandpa," she said it with the certainty of a child who does not experience uncertainty about her relationships. "That is your car. Dad fixed it. It took 30 days. Earl held her with his left arm and kept his right hand on the hood of the Mustang. He could not speak for a moment. His jaw moved slightly, and he was looking at the car with his hand on it and his granddaughter against him and the October light across the Acapulco blue that he had chosen from a sample book in Birmingham 58 years ago, in a world that was also this world, continuous with it, connected to it through all the years between. When he found his voice, what he said was quiet enough that only the people immediately around him heard it. "I know, sweetheart." He said it to Zoe and to the car and to no one in particular and to all the years that had passed. "I know." Marcus moved to stand beside his grandfather. He did not speak. There was nothing that required saying. The car was there. Earl was there. The 3 of them were there, and the photograph was in Zoe's hand, and Earl's hand was on the hood of the car he had chosen and purchased and driven and lost and been given back, and the circle that had been open for 35 years was closed. That was the complete statement. Victoria watched from a distance she judged to be respectful. Her assistant started to speak, and she raised one hand slightly, a small and clear signal, and the assistant was quiet. She watched Earl Hayes stand beside his car with his hand on the hood and his granddaughter against him, and she did not speak and she did not look away. Raymond Aldous stood nearby with his hands in his pockets. He looked at Earl and then at Marcus and then at the car. He did not say anything. Some moments are not improved by having an audience that narrates them. Later in the afternoon, when the formal presentations were finished and the crowd had thinned to the movement of people who stay at events out of genuine interest rather than social obligation, Victoria found Marcus standing near the front of the Mustang while Zoe sat in the passenger seat explaining the instrument gauges to Raymond Aldous through the open window with the authority of someone who has learned a great deal in a short time and considers it important to share accurately. "I would like to talk to you about something," Victoria said, "when you have time for it." Marcus waited. "Hargrove Automotive is moving into a heritage division," she said. "Classic restoration and certification. We have the capital and the client base." She paused in the way of someone being more careful with her words than she usually needs to be. "We do not have the expertise." She looked at him directly. "I believe I found it today." "What would the work look like?" Marcus said. "That is the conversation I am proposing." He was quiet for a moment. He looked across the hood of the Mustang at Earl, who was sitting in the driver's seat now, both hands resting on the original steering wheel, looking through the windshield at the October sky with an expression that had no precise name, but that Marcus recognized as peace, the specific peace of a man who has spent a very long time missing something, and has been given it back without having asked for it. My terms include being in Harwell, Marcus said, and being home by dinner. Victoria said, I understand that. Then we can talk. He did not say yes. He did not say no. He said they could talk, and that was the answer the moment called for, measured and honest and uncommitted to anything except the conversation itself. By late afternoon, the convention park had the quiet of a day winding down. The October sun moved toward the tree line and pushed long shadows across the asphalt, and the white canopy frames and the Mustang sat in its place in the central space in the last of the afternoon light. The Acapulco blue held its depth at 4 in the afternoon exactly as it had held it at 10 in the morning. This was the mark of paint applied correctly to a surface prepared correctly, using a formula mixed correctly. It did not need flattering light to look right. It simply was what it was. Earl sat in the driver's seat for a long time before Darnell touched his shoulder gently and said it was getting late. Earl nodded and took his cane and let Darnell help him out of the car. He stood beside it for a moment. He placed his hand on the roof once more briefly, the way you touch something to confirm that it is real before you leave it, and then he got into Darnell's truck. Marcus drove home on the surface streets. The engine ran beneath him with the authority he had rebuilt it to have the sound of correct timing and correct carburation, and a block given back everything it needed to do what it was built to do. He listened to it the way you listen to music, you know. Well, not analyzing it, but receiving it, finding in the familiar sound the confirmation that what you believe to be true is in fact true. Zoe was asleep in the passenger seat before they reached the second intersection. The photograph of Earl was in her open hand, resting lightly in her palm. Her head was against the window, and the streetlight moved across her face in the gentle rhythm of a child who is having a good dream. Marcus drove through the quiet streets of Harwell, in the early evening, the neighborhood moving past in the Mustang's windows, and he thought about what Victoria had said at the auction. $500. What exactly are you planning to do with a pile of scrap? The words had not been kind and had not been intended to be, but they had been in some unintended way clarifying, not as the fuel for a performance or a demonstration, simply as a moment that made something visible about the distance between how a thing is seen and what a thing actually is. There were things that got undervalued not because they lacked worth, but because the person doing the valuing had not looked long enough or carefully enough or with sufficient respect for what they were looking at. The car had been one of those things. Marcus had for a long time suspected that he might be one of them as well. He had never needed someone else to confirm it for him. But it was useful sometimes when the night was long and the engine would not start to have held the confirmation in your hands before you needed it, to know it was there. He turned onto Clement Street. The garage light was on. Darnell had left it on that morning when he came to collect Earl, and it had been burning through the window onto the driveway all day. The door was open and the light fell out across the pavement in a rectangle, and Marcus pulled the Mustang into it and cut the engine. The silence after the motor stop was the good kind, not the silence of something broken or something absent, the silence of something that has been running the way it was meant to run and has come to rest at the right place at the right time. The silence at the end of work completed correctly. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment. He looked at the tools on the garage wall and the workbench and the legal pad still sitting where he had left it with the schedule written in his handwriting, 30 days laid out in tasks and stages, most of them checked off now in a column of small and careful marks. Then he lifted Zoe from the passenger seat without waking her, her weight settling against his shoulder with the trusting heaviness of a child in deep sleep, and he carried her toward the house. At the door, he turned back once. Earl was standing beside the Mustang in the garage. He had asked Darnell to let him off at the house rather than the hotel, and he had come in through the side door quietly, and now he stood with his cane in one hand and his other hand flat on the roof of the car, not moving, not speaking, simply standing, the way a man stands beside something lost a long time ago and has been given back with the particular stillness of someone who understands that some moments are not improved by rushing them, that some things, if you are not careful, do not come twice. Marcus watched his grandfather for a moment in the light of the garage. Then he went inside and closed the door gently behind him. The car was home.